They called it the Void Terror, a six-limbed armored nightmare that ate tank plating for breakfast and drank the marrow of conquered species. Warlord Gorzon dropped it into the execution pit to make a bloody example of the newest captive, a frail, soft-skinned human. The galaxy expected a slaughter. The crowd screamed for blood. What they got was the scariest apex predator in the cosmos rolling over for belly rubs. Welcome to the day the universe learned you never ever give a human a pet. Caleb Hayes spat a mouthful of iron-tasting saliva into the orange dust. The twin sons of Kalen Prime beat down on the back of his neck, baking the sweat into his worn canvas jumpsuit. He didn't look up at the roaring crowd. He didn't care about them. He was too busy cataloging the aches in his ribs and the distinct throbbing realization that his mining contract was officially void. Caleb was a scrapper, a mechanic on a deep space haulage vessel that had the severe misfortune of blowing a hyperdrive coil right in the middle of Warlord Gorzon's territory. The pirates had swarmed them before the alarms even finished their first cycle. Now his crew was dead. His ship was scrap, and Caleb was standing in the center of a rust-stained gladiatorial arena. The air smelled like ozone-cheap alien ale and stale blood. It was the universal scent of a bad neighborhood, no matter what star system you were in. High above the pit, sitting in a hoverbox constructed from the salvaged husks of Republic dreadnoughts, Warlord Gorzon leaned forward. Gorzon was a massive reptilian brute with scales the color of bruised plums and a jawline heavy with gold piercings. He fancied himself a conqueror. To Caleb, he just looked like a mob boss with a severe overcompensation problem. "Behold the human," Gorzon's voice boomed through the stadium's blown-out speakers, dripping with theatrical disdain. "A soft, water-filled sack of flesh. This is the species that dares to encroach on the outer rim. They build fragile ships. They die fragile deaths. Today we show the galaxy what happens to vermin." Caleb sighed, wiping his brow with the back of a grime-caked hand. "Get on with it, scale face," he muttered to himself. He was tired. His bones ached. He just wanted a cold beer and a shower, neither of which were on the current itinerary. The crowd above stamped their heavy, multi-jointed feet. The metal grating of the arena groaned under the collective weight of thousands of bloodthirsty spectators. They were waiting for the show. "Release the Malagor!" Gorzon bellowed. The stadium erupted. The stamping turned into a deafening, rhythmic thunder. Across the pit, a massive pair of blast doors shuddered. The heavy iron bolts grinding against rusted tracks sounded like a dying starship. Caleb squared his shoulders. He didn't have a weapon. The guards had stripped him of everything except his boots and his grease-stained coveralls. He had a half-empty roll of electrical tape in his left pocket and a loose lug nut in his right. Not exactly an arsenal. From the darkness of the tunnel, something roared. It wasn't a vocal cord roar. It was a mechanical, guttural vibration that hit Caleb square in the chest, rattling his teeth. The dust on the arena floor actually bounced. Okay, Caleb thought, feeling the first real spike of adrenaline pierce through his exhaustion. That's a big boy. The chains snapped. 3 heavy reinforced steel tethers whipped out of the tunnel, shattering against the stone walls as whatever was attached to them tore free. Then it stepped into the light. It was a nightmare of evolutionary biology. The beast was the size of an industrial dump truck. It stood on 4 thick, muscular legs with 2 smaller mantis-like scythes tucked against its chest. Its body was covered in overlapping plates of jagged obsidian black chitin. Acidic drool sizzled as it hit the sand, melting small craters into the arena floor. It had no eyes, only a smooth domed head fitted with deep heat-sensing pits that twitched and flared as it took in its surroundings. A Malagor, an apex predator from a high-gravity death world imported specifically for executions. It was a creature designed to rip mechs apart. The beast snapped its jaws, revealing 3 rows of serrated translucent teeth. It let out another chest-collapsing roar and whipped its tail, taking a chunk out of the concrete wall. Gorzon laughed from his box. The crowd jeered, throwing scraps of food and trash down at Caleb. They were waiting for the human to run. They wanted the chase. They wanted the panic. Caleb stood perfectly still. He didn't run. He just watched the monster. He noticed the way the beast's tail was tucked tight against its hind legs. He noticed the way it kept throwing its massive head back and forth, not tracking prey, but checking the exits. He saw the deep weeping sores where the heavy shock collars and chains had bitten into its armored neck. He saw the nervous, erratic shifting of its weight. Caleb had grown up on a farm in Montana before the resource wars pushed him into space. He'd spent his youth rehabilitating fighting dogs rescued from the underground rings in the city. He knew what mindless aggression looked like, and he knew what sheer, unadulterated terror looked like. The galaxy's deadliest beast wasn't looking for a meal. It was cornered, abused, and terrified. It was expecting to be hurt. Caleb let out a slow, steady breath. He relaxed his shoulders. He let his arms hang loose at his sides. "All right," Caleb whispered. "I see you." The Malagor locked on to Caleb. Its heat pits flared a violent crimson. The soft, squishy meat sack was the only other thing in the arena. In the beast's brutalized mind, anything in the pit was a threat. Anything in the pit meant pain. It charged. The sheer speed of the creature was staggering. Tonnage moving with the grace of a striking viper. The ground shook beneath Caleb's boots. The crowd roared in anticipation of the red mist. Caleb didn't flinch. If he ran, the predator drive would kick in. If he screamed, it would trigger the beast's defensive aggression. Instead, as the monster closed the distance jaws, opening wide, acidic saliva spraying through the air, Caleb did the exact opposite of what every survival instinct in his primate brain was screaming at him to do. He dropped to one knee. He made himself small. He turned his head slightly to the side, exposing his neck, deliberately avoiding direct alignment with the creature's sensory pits. He let out a low, soft clicking sound with his tongue. The Malagor hit the brakes. The sudden deceleration kicked up a massive cloud of orange dust, raining grit down on Caleb. The beast's massive jaws snapped shut mere inches from Caleb's face. The smell was horrendous rotting meat and battery acid. Caleb could feel the heat radiating off the creature's armored hide. The arena fell dead silent. The cheering died in the throats of the spectators. Up in his hoverbox, Warlord Gorzon gripped the railing, his reptilian eyes blinking in profound confusion. Why wasn't there blood? Why wasn't the human in pieces? The beast stood over Caleb, towering above him. It huffed, blowing a gust of hot, foul air over Caleb's hair. It raised one of its massive scythe limbs, trembling. It was waiting for the shock. It was waiting for the strike. "Easy," Caleb murmured, keeping his voice incredibly soft, pitching it low and steady. "Easy, big guy. I'm not going to hurt you." The Malagor flinched at the sound of his voice. Its tail tucked tighter. A low, whining rumble emanated from its chest, a sound completely at odds with its terrifying appearance. It sounded exactly like a frightened puppy. Caleb agonizingly slowly raised his right hand. He kept his palm open, fingers loose. He didn't reach for the beast's head. He held his hand out in the empty space between them, letting the creature close the distance if it chose to. "It's all right," Caleb hummed. "I know. It's loud. It hurts. They're assholes. I get it." The beast shifted its weight. Its sensory pits flared, scanning Caleb's outstretched hand. It couldn't detect the sharp metallic tang of a shock prod. It couldn't detect the hum of an energy whip. It only detected the steady rhythmic thumping of the human's heart and the bizarre calm heat signature of a creature that wasn't afraid. The Malagor took half a step forward. It lowered its massive domed head. Caleb held his breath. The beast gently bumped its cold, hardened snout against Caleb's open palm. Caleb exhaled slowly. He didn't pull away. He slowly curled his fingers, letting them drag against the rough, chitinous scales. "There you go," he whispered. "Good boy. You're just a big, scared boy, aren't you?" Caleb shifted his hand, moving it to the side of the creature's jaw, finding a spot where the armor plating overlapped the softer, leathery skin beneath. He began to scratch. Firm, deep pressure. The beast froze. Its scythe limbs dropped to its sides. The aggressive posture entirely dissolved. The deep, rumbling growl in its chest shifted frequency. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was a purr, an engine block vibrating with relief. The Malagor's legs buckled. The terrifying apex predator, the scourge of the outer rim, collapsed into the orange dust with a heavy thud, rolling slightly to expose the softer, unarmored plating of its lower thorax. It let out a long, heavy sigh that blew a cloud of sand into the air. Caleb cracked a smile. He shifted his weight, sitting fully in the dirt, and used both hands to dig into the heavy plates of the creature's chest, scratching with all his might. "Yeah, that's the spot, isn't it?" Caleb said, wiping away a smear of acidic drool from his boot. "Who's a good boy? Who's a terrifying armor-plated good boy you are?" The beast kicked its back leg rhythmically in the dirt. Above them, the silence of the arena was absolute. 50,000 alien warlords, pirates, and scavengers stared down at the pit in sheer, uncomprehending horror. The human hadn't just survived the Malagor. He had broken it. "What is happening?" Gorzon's voice shrieked over the PA system. The warlord's previous theatrical baritone was entirely gone, replaced by the panicked screech of a bureaucrat who had just watched his spreadsheet delete itself. "Why isn't it eating him, kill him, tear him apart?" The PA system's feedback made the Malagor flinch. The beast whined, trying to tuck its massive head underneath Caleb's arm. Caleb wrapped his arms around the creature's thick neck, shielding its sensory pits from the noise. "Shh, you're fine," Caleb soothed, running his hands over the deep weeping cuts on the beast's neck. Up close, the damage was horrific. The heavy spiked collars Gorzon's men had used hadn't just pierced the skin. They had been welded shut, digging into the muscle tissue. Caleb felt a surge of cold, hard anger. He hated a lot of things about the galaxy. He hated the pirates. He hated the bad food, and he hated the endless black void. But there was one thing he hated more than anything else: animal abusers. "Hold still, buddy," Caleb muttered. He dug into his pocket and pulled out the loose lug nut he had found in his cell. It was heavy, made of solid tungsten. He wedged it between the rusted lock of the shock collar embedded in the beast's flesh and the armor plate beneath it. Using the heel of his boot, Caleb stomped down on the lug nut with all his weight. Crack. The rusted locking mechanism shattered. The heavy iron collar fell away, hitting the sand with a dull thud. The Malagor gasped. It shook its massive head, the relief so palpable it practically radiated from the creature. It pushed its snout firmly into Caleb's chest, knocking the human backward into the dirt, and began licking Caleb's face with a tongue that felt like industrial-grade sandpaper. Okay, gross man, lay off, Caleb laughed, pushing the massive head away, though he didn't stop scratching behind the beast's auditory slits. I'm calling you Barnaby. You look like a Barnaby. Barnaby let out a happy, vibrating chirp. Guards! Gorzon screamed from the balcony, leaning so far over his hoverbox he nearly fell out. Get down there, kill the human, shock the beast. Do your jobs. The heavy steel doors to the arena didn't open. Instead, 4 smaller reinforced hatches around the perimeter slammed down. 12 of Gorzon's elite pit wardens stepped into the light. They were heavily armored mercenaries, carrying crackling electro pikes and heavy plasma rifles. They didn't look confident. They looked at Caleb, and they looked at the mountain of chitin resting its head in his lap. Caleb stopped smiling. The cold anger hardened into something absolute. He stood up, dusting the sand off his knees. Barnaby felt the shift. The beast rose with him. The relaxed, floppy demeanor vanished in an instant. The apex predator returned, but this time the panic was gone. The beast stepped forward, placing its massive bulk firmly between Caleb and the approaching guards. It didn't roar this time. It let out a low, sustained hiss. Its heat pits locked onto the wardens. Its scythed limbs snapped out, locking into position. It was no longer fighting for its own survival. It was protecting its pack. Take the beast down, the lead warden yelled, raising his plasma rifle. Caleb rested a hand on Barnaby's armored flank. Fetch Buddy, he whispered. Barnaby moved. It was a massacre, but it wasn't mindless. The Malagor didn't just attack. It dismantled the squad with terrifying calculated efficiency. It sidestepped a volley of plasma fire, the superheated bolts grazing its heat-resistant shell, and closed the distance before the guards could fire a second volley. A swipe of a scythed limb shattered 3 electro pikes and the arms holding them. A snap of its jaws crushed a heavy plasma rifle into scrap metal. Barnaby didn't eat them. He didn't even bother tearing them apart. He just neutralized the threats, tossing the broken, groaning mercenaries across the arena like discarded toys. The beast moved with the precision of a trained guard dog, keeping itself between the remaining threats and Caleb at all times. In less than 40 seconds, it was over. 12 elite wardens lay scattered in the dust, incapacitated, groaning in pain. Barnaby trotted back over to Caleb, a severed electropike dangling from his jaws. He dropped the sparking weapon at Caleb's feet and sat down looking expectant. Caleb picked up the unbroken end of the pike. Good boy, he said, giving the beast a heavy pat on the shoulder. Caleb turned his gaze upward. He looked past the shocked, silent crowd, straight up to the hoverbox where Warlord Gorzon was standing, frozen in terror. The paradigm had shifted. The Warlord hadn't just given Caleb a death sentence. He had handed him the keys to the most dangerous weapon in the sector. Caleb leaned on the electropike like a walking stick. He looked at the Warlord, then down at the terrifying monster sitting obediently at his side. So, Caleb yelled up at the balcony, his voice echoing cleanly in the dead silence of the arena. Who's next? Warlord Gorzon did not answer the question. Instead, he did what any self-respecting tin pot dictator with a fragile ego would do. When publicly humiliated, he slammed his scaled fist onto the arena's emergency purge console. The stadium's ambient lighting snapped from a dusty yellow to a harsh, strobing crimson. Heavy klaxons began to wail, a deafening rhythmic blare. that sent the 50,000 spectators scrambling over the bleachers like frightened insects. They trampled each other in their desperation to reach the exits, all their bloodlust evaporating the moment the violence threatened to spill out of the pit. Critical containment failure. A synthesized deadpan voice echoed through the PA system entirely unaffected by the chaos. Initiating pacification protocol. High above the sand, 4 heavy blast shields retracted from the arena walls, revealing twin-linked automated plasma turrets. They whirred to life their targeting lasers, cutting through the dusty air, sweeping the ground for biological signatures. Caleb didn't need a manual to know what was coming. "Barnaby Wall," he shouted, pointing toward the heavy steel blast doors they had originally brought the beast through. The Malagor didn't hesitate. It didn't question the command or look for a translation. It simply reacted to the urgency in Caleb's tone and the direction of his hand. Barnaby lunged his massive, heavily armored body, covering the 30 yards in 3 terrifying bounds. Caleb sprinted right behind him, his boots slipping in the bloody acidic mud left by the dead wardens. Zap, 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 zap. The air turned to fire. Superheated bolts of blue plasma rained down from the ceiling, turning the orange sand where Caleb had been standing into glass. The heat washed over his back, singeing the tiny hairs on his neck. He dove, sliding the last 10 feet across the dirt, slamming hard against the rusted plasteel of the blast doors, just as Barnaby skidded to a halt beside him. The turrets swiveled their lasers, tracking the massive heat signature of the beast. "Cover," Caleb barked. Barnaby flattened himself against the door, tucking his head down and curling his heavily plated back toward the center of the arena. He formed a living barricade of obsidian chitin. The plasma bolts hammered into his shell. The impact sounded like sledgehammers hitting a submarine hull. Barnaby grunted a low, vibrating hum of discomfort, but the armor held. The plasma dissipated against the natural heat dispersion ridges of his carapace, leaving glowing orange scorch marks, but failing to penetrate the softer tissue beneath. Caleb crouched in the small triangle of safety between the beast's flank and the door. He examined the control panel embedded in the wall. It was a standard Kalen pattern biometric lock, heavy duty, built to withstand explosives. Unfortunately for Gorzon, it wasn't built to withstand a pissed-off mechanic with a stolen electro-pike. Caleb jammed the sparking broken end of the pike directly into the seam of the control box and twisted violently. The metal shrieked. Sparks showered over Caleb's hands, stinging his knuckles. He ignored the pain ripping the faceplate off to expose the thick clusters of fiber optic cabling inside. He didn't have time to hack it. He didn't have his tools. He just needed to short the primary relay. Caleb grabbed a handful of the exposed wires, praying the grounding in his rubber-soled work boots was still intact, and forcefully shoved the live tip of the electropike into the bundle. The panel detonated in a shower of blue sparks. The locking mechanisms deep within the wall groaned, gave a loud metallic clunk, and disengaged. "Push, buddy, push!" Caleb yelled, slapping Barnaby's side. The beast understood the assignment. Barnaby uncoiled, placing his massive front claws against the heavy blast doors, and threw all 6 tons of his body weight forward. The hydraulic arms fighting to keep the door shut shrieked in protest. Steel bent, gears stripped. With a final agonizing crack, the massive doors blew outward, ripped entirely off their tracks. They spilled into the dark, damp tunnels of the gladiator pens out of the line of fire. Behind them, the automated turrets continued to bombard the empty corner of the arena, too stupid to realize their targets were gone. Caleb leaned against the cool, damp stone of the tunnel wall, gasping for air. His lungs burned. His ribs throbbed where a pirate had kicked him 2 days ago. He wiped a mixture of sweat and grit from his eyes, letting out a long, ragged exhale. Barnaby shook himself like a wet dog, sending a spray of fine dust and tiny shards of melted armor, plating clattering against the walls. The beast turned to Caleb, its sensory pits flaring softly in the dim emergency lighting, and let out a soft, questioning chirp. "I'm good, big guy," Caleb wheezed, offering a weak thumbs up. "Just give me a second. Cardio isn't really my strong suit." Barnaby stepped closer, lowering his massive head to sniff Caleb's chest, checking for injuries. The rough, leathery snout nudged Caleb's pocket. Caleb laughed a dry, raspy sound. "No treats, Barnaby. I'm fresh out. But if we get out of this alive, I swear to God I'll buy you a whole side of beef. Or a car. Whatever it is you eat." The tunnel stretched out before them in a labyrinth of rusted bars and holding cells. It smelled like ammonia, rotting meat, and despair. This was the underbelly of Gorzon's empire. The place where things were kept in the dark until it was time for them to die. Caleb pushed himself off the wall, his grip tightening on the broken electropike. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, pragmatic clarity. They were out of the pit, but they were still trapped in a fortress surrounded by an army of angry mercenaries. "All right," Caleb muttered, his eyes scanning the gloom. "Let's go find a garage and a spaceship and maybe a really big gun." The lower levels of the Kalen Prime Arena were a logistical nightmare designed less for efficiency and more to maximize the psychological torture of its inhabitants. The corridors were narrow, the ceilings low, and the lighting flickered with a sickly, jaundiced hue. For Caleb, it felt uncomfortably like the maintenance ducts on his old haulage ship, minus the persistent hum of the hyperdrive, and add the overwhelming stench of alien feces. For Barnaby, it was a tight squeeze. The beast had to duck his head and scrape his broad, armored shoulders against the concrete walls, leaving deep gouges in the masonry. Yet despite the cramped conditions, the Malagor remained entirely focused. He took the lead, his scythe limbs tucked tight against his chest to save space, his sensory pits twitching rapidly as he mapped the thermal signatures of the tunnels ahead. They moved in silence. Caleb realized quickly that Barnaby wasn't just a blunt instrument of destruction. The beast was a stalker. Despite weighing as much as a small tank, his heavy padded paws made almost no sound on the grating. They passed row after row of holding cells. Most were empty. Some were not. Caleb averted his eyes from the huddled, terrified shapes hiding in the corners of the cages. He wasn't a hero. He couldn't save them. Unlocking the doors would just mean a slower, crueler death by Gorzon's sweeping kill squads. It chewed at his conscience, a bitter pill of reality that he swallowed down with a grimace. Focus on the objective, Hayes. You can't fix the whole galaxy today. Barnaby suddenly stopped. The beast raised a front paw and froze his body, going completely rigid. Caleb instantly pressed his back against the wall, holding his breath. Around the corner, about 50 yards down the corridor, came the heavy synchronized thud of armored boots. Voices echoed down the hall, guttural clicking consonants mixed with the universal tone of arrogant authority. Gorzon's elite pacification squad. They weren't using the PA system anymore. They were sweeping the lower decks manually. Thermal scanners show nothing in Sector 4. A harsh synthesized voice barked through a helmet speaker. "Sweep Sector 5. If you see the human, cripple him. Gorzon wants his skin. If you see the beast, use the heavy ordnance. Caleb peeked around the rusted corner. 5 enforcers. These weren't the lightly armored pit wardens. These were heavily augmented shock troops clad in interlocking ceramic plating and carrying rotary plasma cannons designed to punch through starship bulkheads. Caleb looked at his broken electropike. It was essentially a slightly spicy stick. He looked up at Barnaby. The beast was trembling, but not from fear. The heat pits were glowing a furious, blinding white. A low, barely audible vibration rattled the concrete dust off the ceiling. Barnaby recognized the armor. He recognized the heavy stun batons clipped to their belts. These were the handlers, the ones who had chained him, the ones who had burned him. "Hey!" Caleb whispered, reaching up to rest a firm hand on the beast's jaw. Barnaby's head snapped toward him, the vibration hitching. "I know," Caleb said, his voice deadly calm. He locked eyes with the terrifying creature. "I know what they did, but we do this smart. We don't charge the guns. You follow my lead." Caleb pointed to the ceiling above the enforcers. A heavy industrial coolant pipe ran the length of the corridor, pulsing with pressurized liquid nitrogen meant to keep the arena's underground power grid from melting down. Caleb hefted the broken electropike like a javelin. He wasn't much of a fighter, but he had spent 15 years throwing heavy wrenches across zero-gravity engine rooms. He had aim. "When I make it snow," Caleb whispered, "you take out the trash." Barnaby didn't blink. He couldn't, but his posture shifted. He coiled his massive legs beneath him, pressing himself flat against the floor, ready to spring. Caleb stepped out from behind the corner. "Contact!" the lead enforcer screamed, raising his rotary cannon. "Human spotted!" Before the heavy barrel could spin up, Caleb hurled the electropike. It flew true tumbling end over end, bypassing the guards entirely, and slamming point blank into the pressurized coolant valve directly above their heads. The pipe ruptured with a deafening crack. A massive blinding cloud of liquid nitrogen exploded downward. The temperature in the corridor plummeted instantly to 50 degrees below zero. The enforcers shrieked as the supercooled gas hit their ceramic armor, instantly freezing the servos in their suits and blinding their thermal visors. The narrow hallway was instantly plunged into a thick, swirling white fog. "Now," Caleb said. Barnaby hit the fog like a freight train. There were no roars this time, just the horrific wet sounds of extreme kinetic energy meeting organic matter. The enforcers were firing blindly, their plasma bolts melting holes in the ceiling and walls, but they couldn't track a target moving that fast in the freezing mist. Barnaby used his scythe limbs with surgical precision. He bypassed the thickest armor, hooking the vulnerable joints at the knees and shoulders, severing hydraulic lines, and crushing the fragile meat inside. He didn't linger on a single target. He struck incapacitated and moved to the next before the body hit the floor. It lasted exactly 12 seconds. When the coolant gas finally began to clear, venting out through the rusted exhaust grates, Caleb walked forward. The 5 elite enforcers were piled in a disorganized heap. None were dead, but none were getting up any time soon. Their weapons were crushed into unrecognizable lumps of metal and plastic. Barnaby was sitting at the end of the hallway, meticulously licking a smudge of blue alien blood off his right scythe. He looked up as Caleb approached, tilting his massive head and letting out a soft, questioning hum. Caleb stepped over a groaning enforcer and patted the beast heavily on the shoulder. Good boy, Barnaby. Very good boy. Remind me never to take away your favorite chew toy. They reached a set of heavy blast-resistant double doors at the end of the corridor. Above the frame, a glowing sign in standard galactic basic read, Hangar Bay 4, authorized personnel only. Caleb grinned a genuine crooked smile. All right, buddy, time to steal a ride. The hangar bay was massive, a cavernous vaulted dome carved directly into the bedrock of Kalen Prime. The air tasted of refined promethium fuel and hot metal. Ships of various makes and models were docked on raised hydraulic platforms, sleek pirate interceptors, blocky cargo haulers, and the battered remnants of captured civilian vessels. Caleb and Barnaby slipped through the maintenance doors and hid behind a stack of rusted shipping containers. Caleb scanned the bay. The place was swarming with mechanics and loading droids, frantically trying to secure the area as the base-wide alarms continued to blare. Okay, Caleb whispered, assessing his options. We need something fast, but it needs a cargo hold big enough to fit a 6-ton murder puppy. That rules out the interceptors. His eyes settled on a heavy transport vessel near the back of the hangar. It was an old Corellian pattern blockade runner, modified heavily with thick ablative armor plating and oversized engine nacelles. It was ugly boxy and painted a matte radar-absorbent black. It looked like a flying brick. To a scrapper like Caleb, it was the most beautiful thing in the room. There, Caleb pointed. The black one, that's our ticket. The problem was the security. Standing at the base of the ship's lowered boarding ramp were 2 heavy security mechs. They were bipedal standing 15 feet tall, bristling with autocannons and shoulder-mounted missile pods. These weren't guys in suits. These were automated sentinels wired directly into the base's defense grid. Barnaby, listen to me, Caleb said, grabbing the beast by the thick ridges of his snout. Those things are entirely metal. They don't feel pain. They don't get scared. If you try to bite them, you're going to break your teeth. Understand? Barnaby let out a low, unhappy rumble. I need a distraction. I need to get to the ramp controls to slice the docking clamps, or we can't take off. Can you keep them busy without getting shot to pieces? Barnaby looked at the massive mechs. He looked back at Caleb. He stomped his front right paw heavily onto the concrete and flared his heat pits. It was a clear, unambiguous yes. Okay, on my mark. Caleb grabbed a heavy discarded hydro spanner from a nearby tool cart. He took a deep breath, ignoring the screaming pain in his ribs. Go! Barnaby exploded from behind the containers. He didn't run in a straight line. He moved in a terrifying, erratic zigzag, his claws tearing chunks out of the concrete floor. The heavy mechs reacted instantly. Their targeting lasers snapped onto the beast, and their autocannons spun up with a deafening whine. Brrrt! A hail of heavy-caliber depleted uranium slugs tore through the hangar. Barnaby hit the deck sliding under the arc of fire, his momentum carrying him directly into the legs of the first mech. He didn't try to bite or slash. He used his massive weight, ramming his armored shoulder into the machine's knee joint. The sheer kinetic force buckled the steel. The mech staggered backward, its autocannons firing wildly into the ceiling, raining debris down on the mechanics who were now fleeing the hangar in absolute terror. While the mechs were focused on the 6-ton nightmare tearing up their ankles, Caleb sprinted. He didn't look at the tracers flying over his head. He kept his eyes locked on the control terminal at the base of the boarding ramp. He slid into cover behind the terminal just as the second mech turned its heavy cannons toward him. Barnaby intervened. The beast leaped, grabbing the barrel of the mech's autocannon with his scythed limbs and wrenching it upward. The gun fired, blowing a massive hole in the hangar roof. The mech retaliated, swinging its heavy metal arm and backhanding Barnaby across the jaw. The impact sounded like a car crash. Barnaby was thrown 15 feet through the air, crashing hard into a stack of fuel barrels. He let out a sharp, pained yelp. "Barnaby!" Caleb yelled, panic spiking in his chest. He looked at the terminal. He didn't have time for a delicate hack. He ripped the heavy hydrospanner from his belt and brought it down on the console's primary glass interface with all his strength. The screen shattered. He dug his fingers into the wiring, searching for the manual override relays. Come on, you cheap alien garbage. Where is the bypass?" He found a thick, braided cable leading to the magnetic docking clamps. He pulled his heavy scrapper's knife from his boot and sawed through the rubber casing, exposing the live wires. He grabbed the emergency power feed from the broken screen and jammed it into the clamp relay. Clunk, hiss. The massive magnetic locks holding the ship to the platform disengaged. The boarding ramp remained down, but the ship was free. "Barnaby, to the ship!" Caleb screamed, sprinting up the ramp. The beast pushed himself up from the wreckage of the fuel barrels. His black chitin was scorched, and one of his sensory pits was bleeding a thick blue fluid, but he was moving. He bolted for the ramp, the second mech tracking his movement missile pods, locking on. "Not today, tin can!" Caleb snarled. Caleb reached the airlock controls just inside the ship. He slammed his fist onto the emergency close button. The absolute millisecond Barnaby's heavy tail cleared the threshold. The heavy steel ramp slammed shut and locked with a pressurized hiss just as a micro-missile detonated against the exterior hull. The ship shook violently, throwing Caleb against the bulkhead, but the armor held. Barnaby collapsed onto the metal grating of the cargo hold, panting heavily, his acidic drool sizzling on the deck plates. "Good boy," Caleb gasped, scrambling to his feet. "Stay here. Don't eat the upholstery." Caleb sprinted up the narrow access ladder to the cockpit. He threw himself into the pilot's seat. The console was a mess of alien symbols, but a throttle is a throttle, and a yoke is a yoke. He slammed his hand onto the primary ignition sequence. The old Corellian engines screamed to life, a deep, vibrating roar that resonated through the entire hull. Through the cockpit canopy, Caleb could see Warlord Gorzan running onto the hangar floor, flanked by 20 more enforcers screaming and pointing at the ship. Caleb grabbed the comms array and flicked it to the open hangar frequency. "Hey, Gorzan!" Caleb's voice echoed out of the ship's external speakers, drowning out the alarms. "Thanks for the ride, and thanks for the dog. You really shouldn't leave your pets in the yard." Caleb shoved the throttle as far forward as it would go. The blockade runner lurched upward, the massive repulsor engines tearing the hydraulic platform to shreds. Caleb didn't bother waiting for the hangar bay doors to open fully. He aimed the heavily armored nose of the ship directly at the widening gap and punched the hyperdrive primer. The ship slammed through the partially open blast doors, tearing a 50-foot gash in the metal, and shot out into the starlit sky of Kalen Prime, leaving the Warlord and his crumbling empire far behind. Caleb leaned back in the pilot's chair, watching the stars stretch into the familiar blue tunnel of hyperspace. He let out a long, shaky breath and looked down at the camera feed from the cargo hold. Barnaby was curled up in a massive ball on top of a pile of netting, snoring loudly, his tail completely relaxed. Caleb smiled, reaching into his pocket to pull out a crushed, stale piece of ration bread he'd been saving. "Next stop," he said to the empty cockpit. "We get this guy a proper steak." The hyperspace tunnel cast a rhythmic, hypnotic blue glow across the cockpit of the stolen blockade runner. Caleb sat in the pilot's seat, staring blindly at the navigation console. The adrenaline had finally burned out, leaving a hollow, aching exhaustion in its wake. His ribs felt like shattered glass, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He unbuckled his harness and climbed down the narrow ladder to the cargo hold. Barnaby was exactly where he had left him, but the beast wasn't sleeping anymore. He was curled tightly in the corner, letting out a low, distressed whine that sounded heartbreakingly small for a creature of his size. The blue fluid leaking from his damaged sensory pit had pooled on the metal grating. It smelled like copper and battery acid. Caleb knelt beside him, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. Barnaby uncurled slightly, resting his heavy armored chin on Caleb's thigh. The beast was shivering. The strike from the security mech had cracked the thick chitin along his jawline, exposing the vulnerable pale tissue underneath. Caleb swore under his breath. He was a mechanic. He could fix a hyperdrive with a paperclip and a prayer, but biological plumbing was entirely outside his wheelhouse. He rummaged through the ship's emergency compartments and found a standard-issue Republic trauma kit. It was designed for humans stitching up shrapnel wounds and stopping arterial bleeds. "All right, Barnaby, this is gonna suck, but you have to hold still." Caleb pulled a canister of biofoam and a roll of heavy-duty silver engineering tape from his tool belt. It was a universal truth of the cosmos: if it moves, and it shouldn't use duct tape. If it's bleeding, and it shouldn't use biofoam. And if it's an alien apex predator, hope to God it trusts you. He sprayed the thick, expanding foam directly into the crack in Barnaby's armor. The beast flinched violently, his massive scythe limbs twitching as the foam sterilized and sealed the exposed nerve endings. A warning growl rumbled deep in his chest, rattling the deck plates. Caleb didn't pull back. He placed his bare hand firmly over the beast's snout. I know it burns. I'm sorry, just breathe." The growl subsided into a pathetic whimper. Caleb wrapped the engineering tape tightly around the beast's jaw, securing the foam patch in place. It looked ridiculous, a terrifying 6-ton engine of destruction, sporting a makeshift silver bandage. "Fashionable," Caleb muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "But we need a real doctor." He climbed back to the cockpit and pulled up the nav computer. He couldn't go to a civilized Republic world. A stolen Warlord ship carrying an illegal genetically modified killing machine would trigger a planetary blockade before they even hit the atmosphere. He needed a place that didn't ask questions. He needed the fringe. Caleb punched in the coordinates for Outpost 31, a hollowed-out asteroid primarily used by smuggler scrappers and people who preferred their transactions in unmarked credits. It was a wretched, lawless hive. It was perfect. 3 hours later, the blockade runner clamped onto a rusted docking ring on the dark side of the asteroid. The station's atmosphere was thick with the smell of cheap engine coolant and stale sweat. Caleb walked down the boarding ramp, his heavy scrapper's knife strapped to his thigh. Barnaby followed closely at his heels, his head on a swivel. The beast didn't like the tight corridors or the flickering neon lights. He kept pressing his heavy shoulder against Caleb's leg, seeking reassurance. "Stay close," Caleb murmured, "and try not to look hungry." They found a back alley clinic wedged between a black market cybernetics shop and a dingy noodle bar. The sign above the door simply read, "Miller, Repairs." Caleb kicked the door open. The clinic was a mess of surgical tools, dirty bandages, and half-empty bottles of synthetic whiskey. Sitting behind a stained metal desk was Miller, an older human with a ragged gray beard, a cybernetic eye, and the perpetual scowl of a man who had seen too much and been paid too little. Miller looked up. His eyes landed on Caleb, then drifted to the massive armored nightmare standing behind him. Miller didn't scream. He simply opened his desk drawer, pulled out a sawed-off kinetic shotgun, and racked a shell into the chamber. "We're closed," Miller rasped. "Take your pet monster and get out before I turn it into luggage." Caleb stepped directly into the line of fire shielding Barnaby. "Put the gun down, Miller. He's with me, and he needs a patch job." Miller scoffed, keeping the barrel leveled at Caleb's chest. "Are you out of your mind? Do you know what that thing is? That's a Malagor. It'll bite your head off the second it gets hungry. His name is Barnaby, and he's a good boy," Caleb said, his voice flat, completely devoid of humor. He tossed a heavy pouch of unmarked Kalen credits onto the desk. It landed with a heavy metallic thud. "That's 5,000 credits. I need localized anesthetic heavy-duty dermabond and someone who knows how to staple chitin back together. You want the job, or do I find another butcher?" Miller looked at the credits. He looked at the beast. Barnaby let out a soft, questioning chirp and sat down, carefully tucking his scythe limbs out of the way. Miller slowly lowered the shotgun. "I'm going to charge you double if it eats my medical droid." "Fair enough," Caleb said. The surgery took 2 hours. Miller used an industrial plasma torch to fuse the cracked armor plating and flush the damaged sensory pit with a specialized saline solution. Barnaby hated it. He whined constantly, but he never snapped. Caleb sat on the examination table the entire time, keeping one hand firmly planted behind the beast's auditory slits, scratching the soft skin there, and talking in a low, steady hum. When it was over, Miller leaned back, wiping grease and blue blood off his hands with a dirty rag. "I'll be damned," Miller muttered, staring at the beast. "I've been in the Rim for 20 years. I've seen humans domesticate hellhounds, tame razorbeaks, and teach venomous swamp cats to fetch. But this is a new level of stupid, even for our species." Caleb jumped off the table and tossed Barnaby a massive slab of synthetic brax meat he'd bought from the noodle bar next door. The beast swallowed it whole and licked his chops, looking instantly happier. "We're pack animals, Miller," Caleb said, adjusting his tool belt. "We see something alone in the dark. We want to bring it to the fire. It's what we do." Miller shook his head. "Well, you better keep your fire hot, kid. Word on the station network is that Warlord Gorzan just put 100,000 credit bounty on your head, and he wants the beast taken alive." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Let them come." The ambush happened in the loading bays. Caleb should have expected it. You don't walk through a criminal haven with a 6-ton bounty walking on a leash and expect to go unnoticed. They were 50 yards from their ship when the overhead lights in the hangar blew out simultaneously, plunging the massive cavern into absolute darkness. The only illumination came from the faint, sickly glow of emergency floor strips and the distant stars visible through the atmospheric shielding. Caleb froze. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. Beside him, Barnaby went completely rigid. The beast didn't need light. His heat pits flared to life, glowing a furious molten red in the dark. A deep mechanical growl began to vibrate in his chest. "Drop the weapons and step away from the merchandise, human." The voice came from the shadows, smooth synthetic, and dripping with professional detachment. A heavy spotlight snapped on from a catwalk above blinding Caleb. He shielded his eyes, squinting against the glare. 5 figures stepped out from behind the shipping crates, forming a semicircle, blocking the path to the ship. They weren't Gorzon's mindless enforcers. These were professionals, bounty hunters. Their leader, a tall, broad-shouldered human named Cooper, wore heavily modified environmental armor and carried a shoulder-mounted rail rifle. His crew consisted of heavily armed alien mercenaries, bristling with net guns, shock rifles, and heavy kinetic plating. 100 grand is a lot of money for a grease monkey, Cooper called out, resting his finger on the trigger of his rifle. Nothing personal, friend, just business. We're going to trank the beast and take your head in a box. Make it easy on yourself, and don't make me shoot you in the knees. Caleb slowly lowered his hands toward his tool belt. He didn't have a gun. He had a heavy plasma cutter, a hydro spanner, and a very angry Malagor. You don't want to do this, Cooper, Caleb said, keeping his voice perfectly level. You don't know what you're dealing with. Cooper laughed. It was a cold, humorless sound. I'm dealing with a stray dog and a mechanic. Fire the nets. 2 of the alien mercenaries raised their heavy, wide-barreled launchers. Barnaby, Caleb snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. Break them. The beast didn't roar. He didn't give them the satisfaction of a warning. He just moved. Barnaby exploded forward, clearing 20 feet in a single bound. The net guns fired heavy-weighted mesh, electrified with thousands of volts spinning through the air. Barnaby ducked underneath the first net, letting it sail harmlessly over his back. The second net clipped his hind leg. The electricity arced across his chitinous armor, illuminating the dark hangar in flashes of harsh blue light. Barnaby didn't even flinch. The natural insulation of his carapace absorbed the shock. He dug his claws into the grating and ripped the net cleanly out of the mercenary's hands, tearing the man's shoulder from its socket in the process. The hangar erupted into chaos. Cooper roared orders, firing his rail rifle. The hyper-accelerated slugs tore through the air with a deafening crack, punching holes in the heavy steel shipping crates behind them. Caleb dove for cover behind a stack of fuel cells. He pulled his plasma cutter from his belt and thumbed the ignition. A 4-inch blade of superheated blue plasma hummed to life. It was meant to cut through starship bulkheads, but it would do fine against armor. He peered around the edge of the crates. Barnaby was a blur of black armor and lethal precision. He was using the cramped confines of the loading bay to his advantage, bouncing off crates and using his massive weight to crush the mercenaries before they could track his movements. One of the aliens, a heavily scarred brute holding a shock pike, managed to corner Barnaby against a cargo hauler. He thrust the pike forward, aiming for the beast's unarmored eye slits. Barnaby batted the pike away with his scythe limb snapping the heavy metal shaft like a dry twig. He lunged, knocking the mercenary to the ground, and pinned him under one massive paw. He didn't bite. He just held him there, letting his acidic drool sizzle on the man's armor, effectively taking him out of the fight through sheer paralyzed terror. "Shoot the human!" Cooper screamed, realizing his squad was being dismantled. Forget the nets. Put rounds in the mechanic. A mercenary flanked Caleb's position, raising a heavy scattergun. Caleb didn't retreat. He stepped out of cover, ducked under the scattergun's blast, and drove the plasma cutter directly into the power pack on the mercenary's chest armor. The pack detonated in a shower of sparks, throwing the alien backward and plunging that corner of the hangar back into darkness. "Barnaby, watch your 6!" Caleb yelled over the din of gunfire. A heavy slug from Cooper's rail rifle grazed Barnaby's shoulder, chipping away a massive chunk of armor and sending a spray of blue blood across the deck. Barnaby staggered, letting out a sharp yelp of pain. Caleb saw red. The cold, calculating mechanic vanished, replaced by a primal, furious, protective instinct. "Hey!" Caleb roared, stepping out into the open and throwing a heavy wrench directly at Cooper's head. It clanged loudly against the bounty hunter's helmet, making him stumble. "You don't shoot my dog!" Cooper recovered, swinging his rail rifle toward Caleb. The laser sight settled squarely on Caleb's chest. "You're dead, scrapper." Before Cooper could pull the trigger, a massive shadow fell over him. Barnaby hadn't retreated. The pain had only focused him. The beast dropped from the top of a shipping crate directly onto Cooper. 6 tons of armored muscle hit the bounty hunter with the force of a meteor. The rail rifle shattered into a dozen pieces. Cooper hit the deck hard, his environmental armor cracking under the pressure. Barnaby stood over him, pinning the man's arms beneath his massive front paws. The beast's heat pits were glowing inches from Cooper's face. He let out a slow, wet hiss, snapping his triple-rowed jaws just to make a point. The hangar fell silent, save for the groans of the incapacitated mercenaries. Caleb walked over his chest, heaving the plasma cutter, still buzzing in his hand. He looked down at the terrified bounty hunter, trapped beneath the monster. "Like I said," Caleb breathed, wiping blood from a cut on his cheek. "He's a good boy, but if you ever come after him again, I won't tell him to stop." Cooper stared up at the human and the beast, his face completely pale beneath his cracked visor. He nodded a frantic, jerky motion. "Off, Barnaby," Caleb commanded softly. Barnaby snorted, blowing a cloud of hot breath into Cooper's face, and gracefully stepped off the man. He trotted over to Caleb, ignoring his bleeding shoulder, and nudged Caleb's hand with his snout. "Come on," Caleb said, clipping the plasma cutter back to his belt. "Let's go home." The hyperdrive engaged with a sickening, violent lurch. It wasn't the smooth, seamless transition of a commercial Republic starliner. The stolen Corellian blockade runner kicked like a dying mule, its massive, overclocked engines screaming as they tore a hole through normal space. The cockpit shuddered violently, rattling Caleb's teeth in his skull, before finally settling into the hypnotic, rhythmic thrum of the hyperspace tunnel. The harsh starlight outside the canopy stretched into long, uniform streaks of blinding blue. Caleb didn't immediately unbuckle his harness. He sat perfectly still, his hands gripping the control yoke so tightly his knuckles were white. He simply stared into the blue tunnel, waiting for the adrenaline to finally crash. When it did, it hit him like a physical blow. His vision swam. The fractured ribs on his left side throbbed with a hot, sharp agony that made drawing a full breath impossible. His hands began to shake, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that spread up his forearms. He had survived. He had spit in the eye of a warlord, fought off a professional kill squad, and stolen a heavily armed vessel. He was a wanted man in at least 3 sectors. He had no crew, no home, and precisely 0 prospects. Caleb let out a dry, raspy chuckle that quickly devolved into a wince. He unclipped his harness and slowly descended the narrow access ladder into the cargo hold, his boots ringing hollowly against the grated metal deck. The hold was dark, illuminated only by the sterile white glow of the emergency floor strips and the flashing yellow indicator light of a failing atmospheric scrubber. The air smelled thick and metallic, a heavy blend of burning ozone engine grease, and the distinct coppery tang of alien blood. Barnaby was in the corner. The massive beast was lying flat on his side, his heavy tail completely still. He was meticulously licking the shallow trench where the bounty hunter's railgun slug had gouged through his thick, obsidian chitin. It wasn't a lethal wound, but the raw, pale flesh exposed beneath the armor was weeping a steady stream of viscous blue fluid onto the deck plates. Caleb grabbed the Republic trauma kit from the wall bulkhead and walked over. He didn't mask his approach. He scuffed his boots deliberately, letting the beast know he was there. Barnaby paused. The massive domed head turned toward Caleb. The heat-sensing pits along his snout flared a soft, dim orange. He let out a low, rattling exhale that sounded like a flooded engine trying to turn over, and rolled his bulk, slightly deliberately exposing the wounded shoulder to the human. "I know, buddy. I know it stings," Caleb murmured. He sat down cross-legged on the freezing metal grating, setting the trauma kit in his lap. He popped the latches and pulled out a fresh canister of industrial-grade biofoam and a heavy roll of synthetic bandages. Caleb placed his left hand firmly against Barnaby's uninjured jaw. The sheer scale of the creature was staggering up close. Caleb's hand didn't even cover a fraction of the beast's cheek, yet Barnaby leaned into the touch, his massive scythe limbs tucking tightly against his chest in a posture of complete, unquestioning submission. "This is going to burn," Caleb warned, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Hold still." Caleb sprayed the biofoam directly into the ragged groove. The chemical reaction was instantaneous. The foam expanded rapidly, hissing, as it seared the exposed nerve endings and cauterized the bleeding tissue. Barnaby flinched. A deep guttural growl began to vibrate in his chest, shaking the deck plates beneath Caleb's boots. His heavy claws dug grooves into the metal flooring. It was the involuntary hardwired response of a high-gravity apex predator experiencing pain. In the wild, that growl preceded a slaughter. Caleb didn't pull back. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply moved his hand from the beast's jaw to the heavy armored ridges behind his auditory slits, digging his fingers in and scratching with firm, deep pressure. "Easy," Caleb whispered. "You're okay. I got you." The growl faltered. It broke apart in the beast's throat, transforming into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. Barnaby closed his sensory pits, pushed his massive, heavy snout directly into Caleb's lap, and went entirely limp. 6 tons of lethal, genetically perfected muscle completely surrendered to the hands of a soft, fragile primate. Caleb finished dressing the wound, wrapping the synthetic bandages tightly around the beast's thick shoulder. When he was done, he didn't stand up. He leaned back against the cold steel bulkhead, resting his head against the metal. He kept his hand buried in the thick plating of Barnaby's neck, matching his breathing to the slow, heavy rise and fall of the beast's chest. He looked around the empty, echoing cargo hold. The galaxy was a cynical, uncaring meat grinder. It was a place run by pirates who murdered deep space haulers for spare parts, and warlords who used living, breathing creatures as executioners for sport. You either fed the machine or you got ground up in its gears. That was the rule. That was the reality Caleb had lived with his entire life. But as the steady, vibrating purr began to rumble in Barnaby's chest, Caleb realized that humanity had always played by a different set of rules. Gorzon the Warlord had looked at Caleb and seen prey. He had looked at a hairless, clawless biped from a water world and assumed weakness. He hadn't bothered to read human history. He hadn't realized that when humanity's ancestors were shivering in the dark, surrounded by the glowing eyes of terrifying, bloodthirsty wolves. They hadn't just built taller walls. They had walked out into the dark, found the biggest, meanest wolf in the pack, and offered it a piece of meat. They had taken the galaxy's monsters and invited them to sit by the fire. It was the ultimate evolutionary cheat code. Humans didn't adapt to hostile environments. They pack-bonded with the apex predators of those environments and made them family. They could look into the eyes of a nightmare and see a good boy. Barnaby shifted his weight, letting out a long, heavy sigh that blew a warm gust of air over Caleb's face. His tail gave a single lazy thump against the floorboards. "Yeah," Caleb said quietly to the empty ship, his hand still resting on the beast. "We're going to need a lot more meat." They were just a mechanic and a monster drifting through the endless black void. They were broke-hunted and bleeding. The universe was vast, cold, and entirely unforgiving. But as Caleb closed his eyes, listening to the hum of the hyperdrive and the steady breathing of his dog, he knew they were going to be just fine. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the unbreakable bond between humanity and the galaxy's deadliest good boy, hit that like button and share this story with your fellow sci-fi fans. Want more grounded emotional HFY tales that show exactly why humans are the most beautifully stubborn species in the cosmos? Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. Let us know in the comments what kind of alien beast you would adopt. See you in the next adventure.